All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Doug Rogers. I'm the faculty director of the program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Yale University. I'm just watching the participants number go up as people file in from New York and from New Haven and from around the world. This is just a brief couple of introductory comments to welcome you all to this jointly sponsored event between the Yale program in Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies and the Jordan Center at NYU. This is the kind of event and the kind of distinguished guest which actually involves 3 separate introductions. So I'm going to be very brief and just say it's a delight to have Sean here, and not just to talk about his scholarship, but because as we all find our way around this new media landscape, we are all in many ways following Sean, who's been an innovator in exploring new ways to bring Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies scholarship to broad audiences in new ways for many years now. So we're all indebted to Sean, not just for his research, but for his trailblazing in this field. Josh, you want to say a couple words on behalf of the Jordan Center?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Doug. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to welcome all of you as well. We're incredibly excited to have Sean here today, and we're also incredibly excited to be, for the first time, co-sponsoring an event with the Yale University program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. We were just discussing before we came on, we normally think of co-sponsorship as being geographically constrained, but one of the silver linings of the time we find ourselves in right now is we can do things together with institutes anywhere. So it's a great pleasure to be working with Yale on this. And I'm going to toss it over to Rossen, who is going to introduce our guest today. And Rossen from the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU and Russian and Slavic Studies, will serve as our host for today. And he will be introducing Sean. So Rossen, thanks so much.
Thank you, Josh. My task in introducing Sean Guillory is complicated by the fact that there are not one, but 3 of them. And that's not because I've been drinking too much this morning. The first one is, in a sense, the one most usual to introduce in a setting like this, a historian of the Soviet Union specializing in the interwar period. He earned his PhD from UCLA in 2009 with a dissertation on the Communist Youth League from 1918 to 1928, which remains to this day the definitive text on the Komsomol during its first decade. That was followed by a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh, where he remains as a digital scholarship curator at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So it will be this Sean delivering today's lecture on white chauvinism and international communism, about the Communist Party's position on what was then called the Negro question. The second Sean is probably the best known among you, as he has become a central figure within Russian and Soviet studies and a powerful voice of the whole field to broader publics. He announced his appearance to the world circa 2005 with the start of Sean's Russia blog, where he commented on current events and scholarship. Gradually, his political commentary and historiographical articles migrated to outlets such as Warscapes and Open Democracy, M+1, Jacobin, and The Nation, while the SRB website transformed around 2015 into a weekly podcast on Eurasian politics, culture, and history. This podcast features weekly interviews with academics, journalists, policymakers, and pundits on Eurasia's past and present, geared towards the general public. I listen to every one of Sean's interviews as soon as they appear, and this is how most of the new books in the field reach me, through Sean, the voice of Sean and his interlocutor. And I'm a proud member of Sean's table of ranks as a collegiate counselor of the SRB Empire, which I recommend to everybody as well. You know, it's a great feeling, a member of an empire. The third Sean is very, very personal to me. He's a figure shrouded in mystery, so familiar and yet so distant. I've heard his voice so many times. I perfectly know the tone of his writing too. We found each other so many times commenting under the same set of Facebook posts. For many years, he has been generously sending me translations of Russian texts for leftists, a website that I help edit. And yet for these digital encounters, and despite a vast number of mutual friends, I've never met him in person. He remains a Colonel Kurtz of sorts. And as we were planning this invitation in pre-COVID days, I was very much looking forward to finally tearing off the mask. But this will not be, and the mystery will remain. But I'm still extremely happy to welcome Sean for this virtual session of Yale's Russian and East European Studies program and the Jordan Center. Take it away, Sean.
Well, Rossen, thanks for the incredibly generous introduction, and to Doug and Josh. It's good to see. I've talked to and had correspondence with you, and I've met Josh, and I've interviewed Doug a few times, so it's nice to reconnect. First, I want to say thanks to everybody joining in out there in Zoom land. I really appreciate the support and hearing what I have to say. Now, of course, now the technology comes, I'm going to switch over to my presentation. So hopefully that will go smoothly, but you know, you never know. Oops, see, already made a mistake. And share sound. And all right. Is that up, Josh? Can you give me just a, yeah? Okay, good. So before I get started, I want to say a few words about language. Because language has become so powerful in our current society, especially when it deals with race. So I want to make it clear that when I say the word Negro, I'm quoting a text. If I'm not quoting, I will refer to the subjects I'm talking about as African Americans or blacks. So I just wanted to get that out of the way in case you're wondering why I keep on saying Negro, Negro, Negro. It's because I'm quoting something. I stumbled upon this Yokinen trial, which I'm going to talk about today, while doing some research on Love at Fort Whiteman for an audio documentary I have planned on African Americans, the USSR, and communism in the 1920s and 30s. I won't go too much into who Fort Whiteman was, except to mention that he was the only black victim of Stalin's terror that we know of. And I plan a very large 13-part documentary that hopefully one day will be made. But of course, I'm not the first person to discover or even talk about the Yokinen trial. In American communist history, it's been referred to by people such as Mark Solomon in his great book, Cry Was Unity, which is about African Americans in the Communist Party. And of course, Mark Niason's excellent book, Communists in Harlem, which both treat the 1920s and 30s. And most recently, Jodi Dean, in her book Comrade, devoted a chapter analyzing the Yokinen trial as a way to look at how the Communist Party dealt with issues of comradeship, particularly when you have to expel someone. So, you know, I'm certainly not the first. And I hope to actually, at some point, do an audio documentary on the Yokinen trial and its larger significance. And this talk is really a first articulation of that. So I hope you enjoy it and bear with the stumbling. You know, as I discovered this when I was looking through the archive of the Communist Party, I was really intrigued because, as we know, the Communist Party of the United States didn't do many public show trials, and this is pretty much the first one, and it spawned a bunch of other minor ones. And I found it really more interesting, of course, this summer with the mass protests against police murder and violence against African Americans in the United States, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly the issues around racism and anti-racism. Mostly because, you know, those of you who are participate in left-wing politics, there's often an assumption that in the 1920s and 1930s, identity politics wasn't a main feature of the political struggle and the political movement, and that the obsession of identity politics came mostly in the 1960s. But if you look closely at the American Communist Party, you find that a lot of the things that they were dealing with then, unfortunately, are some of the same things we're dealing with now, and that is questions of racism not only in American society, but racism within our own institutions. How do we relate to people of color and other social others, whether by gender, sex, or preference? So I thought maybe looking at this history might shed some light on that history of dealing with questions of identity and racism and people who commit racist acts. But it became more, I think, important to consider this trial and this moment in communist history, given the predominance of anti-racism today and anti-racist rhetoric. We see a whole bunch of books, seminars, trainings, self-help. The discourse of anti-racism has really bubbled to the surface in the last 6 months. And really, a lot of what anti-racism, the discourse of anti-racism today is an ethical one. And by that I mean, how do we behave? How do we conduct ourselves? How do we speak and how to relate to other people? It's basically trying to uncover not just one's ideological outlook, but really, and this is, I think, the crust of a lot of the self-help type anti-racist discourse, is really how does one conduct oneself? And the Yokinen trial was ethical too. It was a demonstration to members of the Communist Party, but not only, about how is a communist supposed to be anti-racist? What does it mean to be anti-racist? What does it mean to be racist? And the Yokinen trial, like a lot of expulsion trials in the communist movement, whether it's in the United States or in the Soviet Union, dealt with these questions. They were supposed to set out the parameters of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at this anti-racist moment of the past to see maybe what are some differences, what are some similarities? What was all this anti-racism in the 1930s for? So that's by way of an introduction. Now, if you were a avid newspaper reader in 1931, and you opened the pages of the New York Times on March 2nd, 1931, you would see a front page article about a trial that the Communist Party of the United States held in Harlem, at the Harlem Casino, where they put on trial a man named August Yokinen for, quote-unquote, white chauvinism. And this trial is really interesting because, as you can see from the headlines, it went all over the country. The Associated Press picked it up, and you can find articles and mentions of this trial in even the smallest newspapers in the Midwest and the West Coast. It really went around, and I took some of the headlines, just a sample of the headlines, and you can see by the rhetoric, the media was really infatuated this, not just because it was communists, but the fact that the Communist Party actually had the audacity to put a white man on trial for racism. And you can see here in the picture taken from the trial, this is one of the only pictures I've been able to find of all of the participants. Yokinen is the one standing on, I guess, my right. I guess you're right, the one with the tie. That's the young Yokinen. Now, this is the first time the American CP did a public trial, what we would consider a show trial. Most of the time when they wanted to expel a member, they did it behind closed doors and within their own institutions through a body called the Control Commission. Those who are familiar with the history of the Bolsheviks will know the Control Commission well, and what that body was there to deal with ethical violations or disciplinary violations, ideological deviance, etc. So one question immediately comes up is, why did the party do this? If they had been expelling people for racism, which they had been, there are many cases of racism being adjudicated in the Control Commission at the district level, whether it's in Chicago or New York or in Ohio, for example. So why did they feel the need to make a public showing? Why did they have to put forward this statement publicly in this big, production where 2,000 people and the national media witnessed? The other thing that intrigued me about the Yokinen trial is its significance and what people in the the significance people in the American Party gave it. So, for example, in Harry Haywood's Black Bolshevik, he wrote that the Yokinen trial was a significant turning point in the party's work. I always felt that it had a cleansing effect on the party, heightened the consciousness of the cadre, and cleared the deck so to speak, of the most blatantly chauvinist practices within the party. And Earl Browder, who was then the head of the Communist Party, declared on a number of occasions, whether it was in print or in a speech to the International Lenin School in December 1931, where he said that the Yokinen case was really a turning point. Because if it hadn't been for the Yokinen case, our party would not have been on the alert, searching for just such issues as the Scottsboro case to organize the struggle around. And the Scottsboro case, for those who don't know, was a very, very popular, influential case in the early 1930s, where 9 young black men, most of which were teenagers, were accused of rape by 2 white women on a train in Alabama. And the Communist Party of the United States played an incredibly important role to get these young men off from trumped-up charges, so much so that the Communist Party was instrumental in making an international movement. Those of you who've read Meredith Roman's book, Opposing Jim Crow, will know that even in the Soviet Union, there was lots of propaganda and support for the Scottsboro Boys. So the fact that Browder and Haywood both saw this case as significant, I think merits worth thinking about and why they saw it as such. Now, what happened? Well, sometime, it's hard to say because no date has actually been given that I could found, but sometime it seems in mid-January or early January 1931, there was a dance held at the Finnish Progressive Society Hall in Harlem. The Finnish Hall was really popular in left-wing circles. Lots of events were held there. Lots of the workers there were members of the Communist Party. And during this dance, a couple of black guys showed up. The communists prided themselves on their events being interracial. They were probably one of the fewest organizations, at least white-dominated organizations in the United States at the time, that actually had integrated events and prided itself and explicitly stated that. However, in a lot of incidences, you would have a lot of pushback from racist Communist Party members or just racist whites and bar blacks from being part of these events. And this happened in this case. And August Yokinen, who is a Finnish immigrant who came to the United States around 1911, joined the Communist Party in the early 20s. He was a janitor there. And a group of men, white men, surrounded these 3 black guys, pushed them into a corner, and threatened to throw them out of the building. Yokinen was there, but he didn't take part personally in this. What he didn't do is he didn't intervene. And this was one of the hallmarks that if you are a communist, a white communist, and you see racism, you have to do something about it. If you passively sit by and allow it to happen, you are basically capitulating to white chauvinism. So as a resolution on the Negro question published in November 1930 said, they, the white workers, must boldly jump at the throat of the 100% bandits who strike a Negro in the face. This struggle will be the test of the real international solidarity of the American white workers. So this was Yokinen's crime, but he took it even further. There was an investigation done by the New York Control Commission into this incident, and they hauled these Finnish guys, the ones that were party members before the Control Commission, and started to question them. Unfortunately, I have not found any transcripts, only references to this meeting. And all of the Finns, except for Yokinen, recognized their errors, fell on their sword, recounted, said they were sorry, they realized it. Yokinen didn't. He went even further. He reportedly said something like, if Negroes come into the club and into our billiard room at the Finnish club, soon they'll be coming into our baths, and I don't want to bathe with Negroes. So he not only didn't intervene in this conflict, in this Control Commission meeting, he actually expressed racist ideology. Now, Yokinen's racism was not the first nor the last incidents within the American Communist Party or the communist movement in general of acts of racism. And as I said before, the party expelled people for racism. It was a very loud condemnation coming out of the Communist Internationale, and there was a lot of devotion to dealing with this problem, particularly in the United States and, of course, in South Africa. And this impetus, and here's the connection between the really important and I think crucial connection to the party's devotion to deal with racism in its ranks, and that is the Sixth Comintern Congress in 1928. This is a really pivotal moment for the American Party's attitude towards African Americans. At this Congress, besides the political intrigue of demonizing and then eventually expelling Bukharin and people labeled rightists, at the Sixth Comintern Congress, the American Party, or the Comintern, put forward what's colloquially known as the Black Belt thesis. And within this Black Belt thesis, I won't go into too many details of its particulars, but one of the things it's famous for is basically saying that advocating black self-determination in the United States, in the Black Belt, in the southern part of the United States, where African Americans make up majorities. And certainly this idea of African Americans as an oppressed nation, not just a race, but a nation in almost Soviet parlance. You can see the influence of Soviet nationality policy and Soviet nationality thinking in the construction of this resolution. However, I think it's really important to note that this resolution was written by Harry Haywood in conjunction with a Russian by the name of Nasanov. But Harry Haywood was one of the principal theoreticians and writers of this resolution. And there was lots of, if you look at the Comintern archive, there's lots of, back and forths about this and disagreements. But one of the things that's really significant is that this is one of the first times that the American Communist Party took put forward a clear, or at least a statement about what they called white chauvinism. The party, of course, from its very beginnings, rejected racism, wanted to unite black and white workers, and its policy to African Americans went when fits to starts to dormancy in the 1920s. So 1928 is really a breaking period where the political activity, or at least the attention to African Americans and the oppression and their liberation in American communism became a really important point. Now, one of the things that this statement on white chauvinism stated was that white chauvinism is not just found amongst the working classes. We know this. We see it all the time when we're trying to organize workers, when we're trying to do strikes, how the bosses use the racism to divide the working class, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need to recognize that white chauvinism exists within the party itself. And to make matters worse, white workers and Communist Party members have consistently yielded to it. They've done nothing to fight it. The aggressive fight, the statement said, needed to be taken against white chauvinism through a widespread and thorough education campaign to stamp out all forms of antagonism and indifference among white comrades to Negro work. Moreover, the party said that it had to train and promote black members as leaders within the party. And it also made a statement, and a quite explicit one that's repeated throughout, that white workers, it is the responsibility of white workers and white communists to show by action that they are fighting with blacks against racial discrimination and persecution. Black communists in the party had complained for many years about how the party wouldn't make any inroads into black communities if it didn't deal with racism. Racism was fundamental, dealing with racism was fundamental to the Black Belt thesis, black self-determination, and the party's attitude to black politics and the conditions of black people in America. Though this resolution was published and debated and fought over in 1928, it continued to be debated and fought over. So much so it became to frustrate a lot of black leaders, particularly Harry Haywood, who saw the party's efforts towards African Americans basically going nowhere. Though they have devoted a lot of rhetoric, though they've devoted resources, most whites in the party didn't see it as important. Most black party members did their work amongst other blacks through black organizations within the party. At one point in 1929, the party created something called the League for the Struggle of Negro Rights. Harry Haywood and other black leaders referred to this organization as a Jim Crow organization because essentially all quote unquote Negro work took place there and not throughout party's institutions. The frustration got so bad that in January 1931, Harry Haywood, Cyril Briggs is an incredibly important and well-known black radical, and Herbert Newton wrote a 9-page letter outlining the current work amongst blacks in the Communist Party and all of the problems. And they said things like, the party's activities among Negroes has not shown any marked progress. And what's really interesting is that these black members consistently used the Comintern as a way to bash the white leadership. They used the Comintern, which they participated in, like Harry Haywood especially, as an authority to get the white leadership to do something. And one of the things they focused on was exactly this, that the party wasn't doing much against white chauvinism. It wasn't really addressing racism in its ranks. At the present time, a series of outbursts of chauvinism have been witnessed within the revolutionary movement and even in the party itself. In the majority of these cases, it was shown that the party fractions, instead of carrying out a struggle against these chauvinistic tendencies, capitulated ignominiously. And then, in this text, they referred to the Yokinen incident, which until now was one of many incidences of racism within communist circles. In fact, they wrote, during the investigation of the incident in the Finnish club, a comrade by the name of Yokinen expressed the rankest hating sentiments, inferring that Negroes should not be allowed to in the pool room and bathrooms. This document leads to a 9-hour discussion in the American Party's Politburo about its work amongst blacks and racism in particular. In this meeting, this 9-hour meeting, Maud White, who is a young black woman who had just come back from Moscow from attending the International Lenin School and was placed in the Needle Trades Union, began to complain, along with many others, about racism amongst the communists in the Needle Trades Union. When she approached the communist organizer, Mark Gould, about these incidences, she brushed her off. I want to play a clip from an oral history that Maud White gave where she talks about what happened in this meeting and how it resulted in this trial. Hopefully you all will be able to hear it.
An awkward sound settled over the room at Maud's outburst. After what seemed an interminable time, Braddock broke the silence, though I can't recall what he said. Hathaway spoke up, calling for some dramatic action to help resolve the crisis. He proposed a public trial of those involved in the incident at the Finnish Hall. His proposal was seized upon immediately as something concrete. A committee was set to work with the district in organizing such a trial. A renewed campaign throughout the party against white chauvinism and for unity of black and white workers got underway as a result of this meeting.
So what happens at this meeting, I didn't actually set it up properly. Maud White goes in and breaks down in tears. Cyril Briggs, who is known for having a stutter, was yelling so loud that his stutter went away. And Harry Haywood chronicles this moment in his autobiography, Black Bolshevik, at which I should say Maud White, when she gave this oral history, was reading from and referring to. So the idea of Yokinen comes up at this Politburo meeting. So just to step back before getting into the trial and how it came about, I think it's worth exploring a bit what do they mean by white chauvinism. Now, it's really hard to pin down its exact origins. I have yet to find when it was first used in party circles, or really explicit reasons why white chauvinism was used as opposed to, say, racism. Those of you who are, of course, familiar with the Soviet case, particularly the works of Lenin, will immediately think of Great Russian chauvinism, which I think is where this is derived from. It's somewhat taken from Leninist writings and converted for an American context. However, I think there's more to it. I think white chauvinism is supposed to capture more than just racism. And by that I mean excluding blacks from social spaces, treating them horribly, discriminating, calling violence against them, things like this on this individual level. I think white chauvinism was trying to capture an attitude with very many meanings, and you can see some of them here. So, for example, those communists who denied blacks' revolutionary potential were called white chauvinists. Harry Haywood explicitly called Jay Lovestone, the former head of the party in 1928, a white chauvinist for not seeing particularly the revolutionary potential of blacks in the South. A white chauvinist is also someone who's passive to racist acts, people like Yokinen, and of course discrimination, excluding them from events. But it also means refusing or sabotaging Negro work, refusing to participate in it, refusing to see that it was fundamental to the general class struggle. White chauvinism also began to be connected to what was called in the party the right danger. So the Bukharinists, the people who followed Bukharin in the American Party. And they were called white chauvinists because they advocated, at least this is what their critics said, a pure revolution where proletarians first have to carry out revolution, then the rural masses will follow. Well, the vast majority of African Americans in the United States in 1930 lived in the rural South, therefore playing down again their revolutionary potential. Jay Lovestone in particular was charged with seeing rural blacks as reactionary. It also, white chauvinism meant to promote the ideology of racial superiority. So all of this term is trying to capture not just individual behavior, but political attitudes within the party. So why a show trial? Well, those of you who are familiar with the Soviet case will know that show trials played a very important function in Soviet society. On the one hand, they were these actions to adjudicate ideological deviance, crimes, made up ideological deviance, get rid of people who drank too much, who abused their wives, etc. There's a whole litany of violations that one could be expelled for. And the show trial was a way to demonstrate to the public why these things were bad and what is the proper behavior. And in the beginnings of putting together the Yokinen trial, some black communists, like Cyril Briggs, explicitly reference the show trial of Lemuel Lewis and William Brown, who were two Americans working in Stalingrad in 1930, and were put on trial for attacking Robert Robinson, a black engineer who was also working in the Soviet Union. And here I want to play from a clip from a documentary about Robinson and him explaining being in the Soviet Union and being attacked.
Robinson traveled to the Soviet Union with a group of white Americans. He was disliked because of his color.
The same night that I arrived in Stalingrad, the Americans held a meeting to drown me in the Moscow River. So I was on the alert on the very second day after I reached Stalingrad. And on the sixth day, they attacked me. what happened was this: they attacked me by trying to beat me up, to frighten me to leave Stalingrad, because a few minutes before they attacked me, they asked me where I came from. I told them I came just as you came under contract. Then they told me you had better leave here if you want to live your life. We're going to get rid of you.
I apologize for those who aren't able to hear fully that. I tried to turn it up a bit when I saw it in the chat, so I apologize if you weren't able to hear it, but it's basically Robinson describing being attacked and this trial that happened after.
I did.
Oops.
Robinson
Sorry. So after this Politburo meeting, they announced in the Daily Worker that they are indeed going to hold this show trial against Yokinen on March 1st, 1931. Now, there is no one document that I've found that explicitly explains why the Yokinen trial, why Yokinen was singled out as the person, the figure to demonstrate white chauvinism. Now, I can only surmise, and these are the reasons why I think he was chosen. First off, is Yokinen fit a profile? 62% of the Communist Party in the United States were citizens, but 65% of the membership were quote-unquote foreign-born. And in the party, they had ethnic language institutions. So the Finns had one, the Jews had one, the Lithuanians, Ukrainians, etc. So ethnic identity was really strong in the American Communist Party, in the United States, I think, in general, amongst white ethnics. And a lot of the incidences of racism occurred in spaces where white ethnic groups predominated. So some of the examples that were brought forward in party documents are amongst the Lithuanians, amongst the Ukrainians, amongst the Finns, amongst Jews, etc. Moreover, Finns were the largest ethnic group within the Communist Party after Jews. So they were the second most common white ethnic group. So I think that one of the reasons they chose Yokinen was to send a message in this way too, amongst the white ethnic groups within the party, because there was also an effort to weaken the power of these organizations and try to quote unquote Americanize the American Communist Party. So in the Daily Worker, there was an announcement on February 16th, 1931, saying that they were going to hold this trial. Now, the trial is organized really quickly. In fact, some of the first plans for it were far more elaborate than it actually occurred. So, for example, one of the things they planned to do is to involve witness testimony, so to actually bring up a couple of the black guys who were at the Finnish club to testify. And then they were going to allow some testimony from audience members. They were going to have an assistant prosecutor. They were going to have a panel of judges, etc. For some reason, not really sure why, they got rid of all of that. And they trimmed things down quite, simply. So they had a judge who was Alfred Wagenknecht. They elected 14 jury members, half of which were white, half of which were black. It's all very interesting, organized racially. So half white, half black jury. Clarence Hathaway, who is the head of the New York district and the editor of the Daily Worker, who is white, would act as prosecutor. The defense attorney would be Richard B. Moore, who is black. So you have this, very well-crafted, orchestrated show. And then, of course, you have no witnesses. Witnesses are waived. And you have Yokinen as the defendant. And basically the trial comes down to this. They organize at the Harlem casino, which today I should say, and has been since the 1970s, is a mosque in Harlem, where Malcolm X apparently used to speak. They go in the Harlem casino. There's about 1,500 to 2,000 people present. The numbers vary. And essentially what happens is Hathaway gives up and gives a speech. Then Richard Moore gives up and gives a speech. Yokinen gives his testimony. And then Moore and Hathaway give their arguments for how Yokinen should be dealt with. And of course, it's great fanfare, and there's music and slogans, etc. It's the whole show. Now, what happens at this trial? And laying out not only Yokinen's guilt and what he did, but its meaning. Now, Hathaway, he gets up and he lays out the party line on the so-called Negro question. He makes arguments for the importance of black self-determination. He compared Yokinen's act as, quote, acting as a phonograph for the capitalists. So really driving hard that, racism is not, it's more than just an individual crime. It's a class crime. And by engaging in racist acts, you are siding with the capitalists. So yeah, Hathaway gets up and says, we need to understand that the class struggle requires the unity of black and white workers, and to think otherwise is very dangerous. This attitude is a very dangerous one. Comrade Yokinen was given another indication that his was only a formal acceptance of equal rights for Negroes without accepting it in practice. He was ready to adopt the resolution for equal rights, but he did not want to grant equal rights in the Finnish Workers' Club. And this is one of the problems they repeatedly have, where you would certainly have people voting for resolutions condemning racism and things like this, but in practice, in the Bolshevik parlance of deeds, it was not carried out. Hathaway stood up and called for Yokinen's expulsion. And he said that we need to get rid of this guy and people like him, because if we say, it's okay, we're not going to expel you, then black people won't take us seriously, and white people won't take us seriously. They think that we'll tolerate racism in our own ranks. So Yokinen needs to be expelled, and he can come back if he shows in practice that he's gotten rid of all of these racist ideas. Richard Moore stood up and gave his speech. And he didn't challenge Hathaway's assessment. He didn't challenge really much of what Hathaway said. In fact, he wasn't there really to challenge or counter or even defend Yokinen. He wasn't there to get Yokinen off as the defense attorney. Moore's role was far more important and interesting. Moore was there to basically say, wait a second, not so fast. Getting rid of Yokinen is, Yokinen's a problem, but we need to look at ourselves. By cutting him out, you may be getting rid of the, part of the disease, but the cancer still exists. Because as he said, are we so different? You in the crowd, we here up on stage, are we so different from Yokinen? Examine yourselves. Have we carried on within the various workers' organizations and within the Communist Party itself a broad campaign of education to stress the importance of this question, to clarify the workers and to root out chauvinist prejudice against the Negro workers? We have not sufficiently carried out this task. And this is one of the reasons why this rank-and-file worker has committed this crime. We ourselves share the crime of Comrade Yokinen. Moore pleaded against basically Yokinen's expulsion, his political death, and made a statement that was widely quoted in the media at the time. And I'm sharing it with you just because it's widely quoted. We must remember that a verdict of expulsion and disgrace from the Communist Party is considered by a class-conscious worker as worse than death at the hands of the bourgeois oppressors. As for myself, I would rather have my head severed from my body by the capitalist lynchers than to be expelled from the Communist Internationale. And of course, there's applause after. Very dramatic. Yokinen then gets up to give his statement. He admits his guilt. He sees that it's, racism is against the party. He doesn't excuse himself, and he begins to demonstrate what an anti-racist communist is supposed to be and supposed to think. I see now that this white chauvinism is not only an outrage against the Negro workers, but it is also a crime against the working class as a whole. At the time of my white chauvinist statements, I was under the influence of these anti-communist and anti-proletarian ideas that are foisted upon us by the ruling bourgeoisie. But I do not wish to bring out these facts as an excuse for my conduct. As a member of the Communist Party, I should have been a staunch supporter of the line of the party. I asked this workers' court not to deprive me of the opportunity to further carry on my activity for the Communist Party and for the working class. I pledge myself to fight unflinchingly against all tendencies of white chauvinism among the workers, to fight for the social, political, and economic equality of the Negroes, and for the solidarity of the working class as a whole. So Yokinen is expelled, but with conditions. He's expelled for 6 months, and if he wanted to come back to the Communist Party, he had to show in practice, how to redeem himself. And you can see here the report of the jury. He had to, first he's expelled, but if he wants to come back in to be readmitted, he has to go give speeches. He has to conduct mass meetings about his mistake. He has to, show himself at the forefront of the struggle against white chauvinism. He has to join the League of Struggle for Negro Rights. He has to sell their newspaper. And he has to put himself at the head of the struggle, like all of this performance. So these, 5 things are performing what an anti-racist in the party is supposed to be. A couple of things about how the Communist Party dealt with this in media. Here's a cartoon from the Daily Worker. They had this cartoon, The Adventures of Bill Worker, where they dramatized some of the politics. I just wanted to show this. I'm not going to go into it. Here are some of the headlines from the Daily Worker newspaper. In particular, I found a warning telling readers that, don't take this Yokinen trial as a one-off thing. We have to root this out from our party organizations and amongst ourselves. And there's a whole flurry before and after the Yokinen trial of articles about white chauvinism within the ranks of the Communist Party. Now, given this, what does it mean to be an anti-racist communist? Well, in many respects, it's almost the opposite of being a white chauvinist. You have to recognize that blacks' revolutionary potential was fundamental to the class struggle. You have to be active in Negro work. You have to put yourself as a white person on the forefront of the struggle against white supremacy. You have to welcome black people into the party, into party spaces. You have to recognize that white chauvinism is a crime against the whole working class, not just blacks. You have to be a staunch supporter of the party line. You have to take action against racism when you see it. And it's interesting, in one of the documents discussing about how to be anti-white chauvinism, it read, "This class ideology must be ruthlessly fought and mercilessly exposed, not from any liberal or humane considerations about justice to the Negroes, but from the correct Bolshevik standpoint, it must be shown to the white workers that American imperialism tends to deny democracy in general, freedom of speech, assembly, equality of sex, etc., and the struggle of democratic rights of the Negro in particular. Hence, the struggle of the Negro masses for social equality and self-determination is directed at the very foundation of the imperialist dictatorship in the United States, the voluntary union of the masses of Negro and white peoples based upon mutual confidence is the essential prerequisite for the victory of socialism in this country. I was really struck by this, and I've been thinking since I read it a few weeks ago what to make of this statement, not from any liberal or humane considerations about justice to the Negroes. And this is really in contrast to some of the anti-racist rhetoric today, which is suffused with issues of justice, dignity. And these, of course, there's nothing wrong with this. But it also points out the difference, at least in communist circles, anti-racism it was about something bigger. It was about a different type of society that needed to be built. The goal of anti-racism was to facilitate that class struggle. As this portion that I read ended, it is a prerequisite for the victory of socialism in this country. So I thought that was an interesting contrast that I'm still kind of struggling with, this issue of justice and where it lies, and what it means. Now, Yokinen's fate didn't end there. The day after the trial, an arrest warrant is issued for Yokinen as an immigrant or a non-citizen that is a member of an organization, i.e. the Communist Party, that advocates the violent overthrow of the American government. And under the Alien and Sedition Act, passed in 1918 and revised in 1920, Yokinen should be deported. He's arrested. He's got out of jail with a $500 bond put up by the Communist Party's International Labor Defense Organization, their legal arm. And Yokinen goes around and starts giving these talks about racism, and he does his duties, selling the newspaper, etc. However, the party makes this shift to now defending Yokinen, defending the foreign-born, not just with rallies in the street and protests, but also fronting for his legal defense, which eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Moreover, they began to tie this defense of the foreign-born, as they put it, with black politics. They began to equal, as one of these headlines says, to hit deportations and lynching. They started to try to meld both of these struggles together. Now, Yokinen's trial, he was eventually housed at Ellis Island for about 9 weeks after he was rearrested. And his case did get appealed to the Supreme Court. But in October 1932, the Supreme Court decided to hear his case. Therefore, it held the lower rulings on his deportation. And I have to say that his defense was a really poor one. They essentially tried to argue that Yokinen, at the moment of the arrest warrant, Yokinen was expelled from the Communist Party. Therefore, he wasn't actually a member of the Communist Party. They also have some mistakes that said that he was only there for 2 years, where in fact he had joined in the early 20s. But it didn't fly. Even on a legal level, it didn't sound too good, but they tried. Interestingly enough, though, on the same day the Supreme Court ruled against Yokinen, they ruled in favor of the Scottsboro Boys and ruled to give them a new trial under the 14th Amendment's denial of due process. So it's an interesting, if you think back to what Browder said about Yokinen leading to the party's involvement in the Scottsboro case, in the Scottsboro case, the party won, but Yokinen himself lost. One of the problems for Yokinen's deportation was where to send him. If you know this, Finland at the time had a right-wing anti-communist government, and if he was deported to Finland, he would have certainly ended up in prison, if not worse. So he ended up going to the Soviet Union and living his life out in Karelia, around the Finnish border. And what about the show trials themselves? The Yokinen trial spawned a bunch of smaller trials, less publicized trials throughout various Communist Party organizations. And like a lot of these cases of trying to root something out through these adjudications, they began to take a formalistic way. And they begin to create lots of suspicion and resentment. And at one point, in 2 years after the Yokinen trial, Earl Browder begins to comment on this in a report, The Tasks of Our Party. And I find this quote really quite amazing. He says, however, we must say that there has been a certain tendency for a large mass production of white chauvinist trials in which quality has been sacrificed to quantity. We have begun to develop a certain Model T white chauvinist trial, the quality of which is very, very bad. The cylinders don't hit, the fenders drop off, the workmanship on the thing is the most inexpert and sloppy work. This is what we have in this mass production of white chauvinist trials, the most primitive stage of mass production, where the whole intent is to produce a large supply of what appears to be the right thing, and which won't stand examination, a complete sacrifice of quality to quantity. I think in the struggle against white chauvinism here, if anything, we have got to insist absolutely on quality. Quantity is not so important right now. Quality. So you can see how in many respects, even the party found the show trial having its limits. And what about Yokinen's fate? What happened to him once he got back from Karelia? Went to the Soviet Union. Well, luckily he has a party file, and I got a copy of it. And Yokinen seemed to live out his life, survived the war, worked in a factory, and here is a request from 1957 asking for his pension. In his party file, when he gets to the Soviet Union, he joins the Communist Party. There's a transcript of his entry where he admits freely that he was expelled for racism, that he went back. He was actually readmitted in August 1931. So he goes and lives his life. What he does between his arrival in the Soviet Union until the war, it's hard to say. But, I found it interesting because it showed that Yokinen was indeed a real person that had a life beyond this incident that befell his life. So just to kind of conclude some concluding thoughts, again, I thought it's really interesting to look at this as an example of how a political organization tried to deal with racism within its own ranks, and some of the ways it contrasts with anti-racist rhetoric today. Now, on the one hand, as I said earlier, it really is about the self. Right? This trial in the Yokinen case is to demonstrate, what does it mean to be a racist or a white chauvinist, and what it means to be, to oppose it, or to be an anti-racist. At the same time, I think one of the differences one can say in the rhetoric today, and I wonder this myself, and maybe those of you out there have some thoughts of this. I don't have a definitive answer. What is the goal of anti-racism today? What is it? What are we trying to achieve? What is the society that we imagine when we overcome racism? In the communist case, it was very easy. They said explicitly, repeatedly, ad nauseum, that anti-racism was about the class struggle. Anti-racism was about building a better world through socialism. So I'll just end that with, to think about when we hear about anti-racism today, like for example, I was watching the Lakers last night, the playoff game, and was really struck by all the labels of anti-racism on the court, on players' uniforms, in commercials. And I just can't help wonder in all of these performances, this ethics of anti-racism. What is the world that's being achieved here? What are the corporations trying to achieve when they say, Black Lives Matter? What are we trying to achieve when we say Black Lives Matter? What are Black people trying to achieve when they say Black Lives Matter? So I think that looking at this Yokinen case, I think reminds us that we have to figure out what is the higher goal for all of this and where is it taking us. So thank you for listening.
Sean, thank you so much for a wonderful talk that illuminates this this episode in history and so nicely ties it to much more contemporary and pressing issues today. So we have some time for some back and forth and for questions and answers. I think what we're going to do is, if you would like to ask a question of Sean, put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will sort of filter these through and ask them to Sean, and give him an opportunity to respond. And while you are formulating your questions, let me just ask one of my own that struck me as we were as I was listening to this. And Sean, the question is just if you could give some sense. It's so striking to watch all of the connections and the back and forth and the similarities and the mutations of things moving back and forth between the Soviet Union and the United States at this time. One of the differences, of course, is that the communists in the Soviet Union controlled the state apparatus and they didn't in the US. And I wonder if you could give a sense of how did this issue, or either this specific trial or the larger issue of white chauvinism, appear to the US state, or the various kinds of agencies of the state that were interested in communists and anarchists and surveillance and monitoring or prosecuting these kinds of things at the time, or for that matter to capital, to the corporations who might have been struggling with the communists. Where did this fit in their vision of the world?
It's hard to say because there's the surveillance. Of course, the American state was surveilling all of these people and all of these activities. I could just tell by some of the general attitude from the media, and some of there was a few like op-ed reactions to this. I should state, actually, on the one hand, amongst the black press, there was a lot of celebration of this and comments of like, is there any other white organization in this country that's doing anything like this? No. And there was actually a lot of appreciation. So in that case, like, one of the goals of the party in doing this was to do exactly that, and they were fairly successful. In terms of American society as a whole, a lot of it was put into a frame that had existed since the Russian Revolution, and that is the Bolshevik hand behind American blacks, manipulating them, poisoning them with all of this, communist, anti-racist stuff. Seeing this as basically a Bolshevik plot. So it's definitely put into, and here I think one of the things that's really interesting, and I personally don't know if somebody has written about this really in detail, and if they have, I would love to know, and if it hasn't, I would love somebody to do it, is here in the 1920s, you really get a crystallization of white supremacy and anti-communism. These become completely, you can't pull them apart. And you see this really clearly in Robin Kelly's book, Hammer and Hoe, about communist organizing in Alabama, that being a communist and being an anti-communist and being a white supremacist are really, really connected. So it got funneled into that narrative.
Question from detailed question from M.A. Johnson, who I believe is the same as the Pasha Johnson I know in real life, but I'm not entirely sure given the interface. So noting that the jury in the Yokinen trial also appears to reflect the diversity in foreign ethnicity, you indicated this, of the Communist Party. I'm not going to get all the names here.
Yeah.
Is the Haywood jury member listed Harry Haywood, or Haywood
yes.
Not prominent in the Communist Party?
No, it's Harry Haywood. It is Harry Haywood.
Alex Jackson asks, is there any evidence of direct Comintern involvement in the trial itself, or Soviet reactions to the trial? Can you trace this in the Soviet press?
I haven't found any mention in the Soviet press. There is no direct Comintern link. There is a lot of paper going back and forth about the resolutions. And I think this is mostly bureaucratic. And because they produce a resolution and then they're sent to Moscow, to the Comintern. But I think it's worth worth remembering that when the Comintern got all this stuff, it was probably a couple of months after the fact because of the way mail went. In fact, and this is another interesting thing about the creation of the American Communist Party archive itself. All of these documents were shipped to Moscow at some point. A lot of them, I presume, were lost. So the footprint isn't there. In fact, you do get some complaints, particularly at the Sixth Congress of the Comintern, where Comintern officials, the Russians, are saying, "You guys have like what, 50 black members? What's your problem? Like, why aren't you doing anything?" So there is some astonishment, I think, from the Russian side as to why the American Party can't deal with this problem correctly or forcefully. But in terms of a direct connection to authorities in Moscow, if it exists, I have not seen it.
That's great. So I have two questions that ask you in different ways to situate this in broader dynamics. One from Lisa Kirschenbaum asking, given that gender was very much connected to the Scottsboro case,
yeah,
especially fears of black masculinity and protecting white womanhood, is there a gender dimension to what you see going here about blacks wanting to keep the Finnish blacks out of the Finnish hall or of the trial? Do you see intersecting gender dimensions here?
Actually, not at all. I mean, they do, when they talk about white chauvinism in general, in like the party press or even behind closed doors, the only time they make any gendered reference is when they point out what they say is the lie of, black men preying on white women. That this is the lie that the capitalists use, and you can see it most, clearly in the Scottsboro case. But surprisingly, there isn't a lot of that. I haven't seen a lot of gendered references. I mean, there's even, not that much gender talk even for black women. There's some, but not on the level that I think, one would expect given the rhetoric on this question. And the place of black women as workers and the type of work they do. So surprisingly, there isn't, though I could have missed it.
Thanks. So, and the second of these sort of, could you situate it in broader context, comes from Daniel Candy, who's an honors college student at Western Kentucky University. So welcome. In particular, and the question here is about Daniel's been reading Robin Kelley, the historian Robin Kelley's book,
yeah.
Summer and Hoe, and notices, he says, anecdotes about white communists in Alabama occasionally referring to their black comrades as comrade N-word. And his question is the CPUSA enforcing or dealing with white chauvinism differently in the North and the South?
It's hard to say, and I'll tell you why. The Alabama party, the party in the South, the records aren't as good. And the reason why the records aren't as good is that they were essentially an underground party. So just to give an example, like when I've seen documents about membership and they would break down how many members they have in, say, New York or Chicago or whatever, the District 17, which is the Montgomery, Alabama organization, is always left blank. So I don't know, and I don't have an answer to that question. There are, of course, complaints, about white members being racist in the South. But in terms of adjudicating it through the control commissions, I'm not sure, just because, if come to think of it, I don't know if I've seen documents for the control commission to even say.
But an excellent, like senior thesis topic or
yeah.
something to explore. I can imagine there'd be great things to chase on that topic.
I should say that the entire American Communist Party archive is on microfilm. So if you want to do anything before 41, it's available. So I highly recommend people go through it.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a question from Anthony Anemone, which you may need to do some work to contextualize, Sean. I'm not sure I know the scholarship and the conversations around it's enough to frame this one for you. I'll just read you the question. Sean, how would you respond to those who argue that the Communist Party's struggle against racism was nothing more than hypocritical part of the party's struggle to delegitimize democracy?
So to delegitimize liberal democracy. Well, first off, I'll say this about whether it's hypocritical. They sure did produce a lot of time and a lot of documents about this, and mostly internal documents. Now, those of us who study the Soviet Union and look at Communist Party archives, we know a lot of paper is generated for the sake of paper. But it seems that the internal struggle of trying to get this issue taken seriously existed. There was attempts to deal with it, but like a lot of organizations, their attempts either went to a certain point and stopped and ran out of steam, or other things got in the way, and it wasn't as prioritized. But I do feel that it was a sincere effort. In terms of delegitimizing liberal democracy, I mean, when it comes to the race issue, did the Communist Party really need to do that? They had a lot of African Americans' daily lives already delegitimized liberal democracy enough amongst those quarters. Maybe I don't really understand the question in terms of the liberal democracy part.
Well, I'm going to jump over to, I've come down to Peter Rutland has a question, which I'll come to in a moment, but Josh had a follow-up question on what you were just talking about, so that may help us clarify some of the issues.
Yeah, Sean, I just wanted to get a sense of like the extent to which maybe on the Soviet side of things, right, was this referenced by Soviet nationalities who felt like, issues related to discrimination against ethnic minorities was not being addressed within the Communist Party in the Soviet Union? Or was this kind of kept as like, was this seen as sort of like a totally different orthogonal? Because I do think that question about the extent to which the Soviet Communist Party cared about I think this is a fundamental question here. Is it the extent that they care about racism as a fundamental issue, or this is just seen as one of, 800 different fifth columns that could be entered in people who they're struggling with, and it's convenient here, it's convenient in other cases. So I'm wondering, did it ever reverberate back within the Soviet Union's dealing of its own ethnic national minorities?
I don't think so. I don't think it reverberated back. I don't really have an answer as to why. One could just be language. This stuff is all in English. If it did go into the Comintern, then it was translated, but the Comintern was a very particular institution. There were, articles published about racism in the Comintern press, but again, I don't know if that's something that would trickle down to ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union. In terms of was this a serious issue that they tried to deal with, or was it just a potential exploitable fifth column? The answer to that is yes and yes. I mean, I don't think those are two mutually exclusive things. But I want to stress here, though, because there is this tendency to look at the strings coming from the Soviet Union on this. And that this is emanated from some outside force. I think it's really important, and people who've written about, say, African Americans and the Africa diaspora within the Comintern have pointed this out, like Minka Makalani has pointed this out in his book, and others, is that what's really fascinating about the Comintern is that this was a space for African Americans and people from the wider African diaspora to come together and meet people from other places, whether they're anti-imperialist activists from Asia, Middle East, South America. And when you look at the commissions for the formations of these policies, you see not only African Americans, you see South Africans, you see Russians, you see Indians, you see Chinese sometimes, you of course see white Americans. So the Comintern is a really interesting place that exposed a lot of people, like Harry Haywood is a good example of this, but also other African Americans who traveled to the Soviet Union, a different perspective on their own struggles back home. And the thing is that the Bolsheviks also treated these people as celebrities to a large extent, because they were the information conduits for understanding race in America, for example, or in South Africa. Now, did they accept everything? No. Did they not put it into their own ideological foreign policy framework? Of course they did. But the Comintern also allowed for the participation and the formulation and also a point of authority that African American members of the party could use against the white leaders in the United States. And I think this is what's really important and fundamental about the connection with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, Peter Rutland has another version of this, or another question in the same vein of tracing these connections, and I'll just read it to you. I believe it was at the 1928 Comintern meeting where U.S. delegates raised the question of, quote, American exceptionalism, which was later picked up by Stalin. The first time this phrase was used anywhere. Is this correct, and was it connected to the race question, this issue of American exceptionalism articulated in a Comintern context?
First, I'll say this is something I haven't looked very closely at. It was connected to the race question because the American exceptionalism argument, and here I'm speaking about looking at from memory transcripts in the Comintern discussions. The argument of American exceptionalism was a way for to say that no, African Americans are a race. They're not a nation. There's no relationship between, say, ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union or the situation in India or China. Race is something particular to the United States. And a lot of people like Harry Haywood, and people who supported him were pushing back against this idea. And also it got embroiled into factional fights as well. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the formulation of the Black Belt thesis, it's totally tied in with factional fights against the right or the imagined right in the American Party. So in those cases, it's mimicking similar political trends within the Bolshevik Party.
Fascinating. So let me ask a question on behalf of Jim Dingaman. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Both of this is a two-part question, both of which deal with sort of trajectories of this case later on the U.S. Side of things. How do you see this manner of handling white chauvinism as morphing into, or I guess more broadly related to, the New Left or the Black Power movement in the 60s? Is there any connection you would want to draw there? And then second, what is your take on the disputes on Black combat leadership in the Spanish Civil War, particularly as they relate to the death of Oliver Law? That's in details that I'm not going to be able to know, but maybe you know the connection there.
I'll answer. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about the second question to even begin to say anything. So my apologies there. In terms of the Black Power movement in the 60s, again, this is something I can't directly speak to, except to say, I think it would be interesting to trace some of these lineages, particularly around the issue of self-determination, into the 60s to see if, is there a consistency or is there a break? And trying to get at, because of course, one of the things we have to remember is that within the Communist Party, and one of the reasons why they begin to take self-determination seriously is because of Black nationalism. The Garvey movement in the 20s is the largest political organization radical political organization for Blacks. And so they're trying to give they're playing this ideological dance between, on the one hand, recognizing the currency of nationalism and its appeal, but on the other hand, trying to not allow, here you get the Bolshevik case too, similar to the Bolsheviks. They're trying to stamp out nationalism. So what's interesting, and one of the things I didn't mention, is you have a corollary to white chauvinism is Black chauvinism. And Black chauvinism is the belief that the whites can never be, to put it in today's terms, allies in the liberation of African Americans. So I think it would be interesting to see the lineages, the intellectual lineages, to see how they connect, because you do have some people like Harry Haywood or William Patterson and others who supported Patterson eventually came on board. And you have people like George Padmore, for example, who is in the party and then becomes a Black nationalist or a Pan-Africanist. how these ideas translate later in time.
We are out of questions at the moment in the Q&A. I couldn't tell whether Rossen, you wanted to jump in with a question or a comment there of your own.
Sorry, don't know whether you're listening to me, but
I can hear you.
We can hear you.
Great. But I wanted to extend this question about the continuity to the civil rights period. And the Communist Party experiences essentially a loss of monopoly, being, really the one majority organization defending, committed to anti-racist politics. And that is no longer the case in the 50s.
Right.
Just wondering how they deal with it, because maybe by the 50s they're such a small organization that it is not really such a relevant question. But is there, what is the Communist Party's role in the civil rights movement, and what is the continuity from this pre-war period?
Some historians who look at the history of the civil rights movement, and this is something I'm not totally up on all this historiography, but there's an idea of the long civil rights movement. And that long civil rights movement puts the communists of the 20s and 30s ahead of the curve. So in this case, by the 50s, the curve is already beginning to emerge with the communists being left behind. But here, I think there is a bit of a revival of this white chauvinism thing in the late 40s. And people have told me there's also a campaign that goes on that's not unlike this one of the early 30s. I haven't looked at it, and it's kind of outside my time frame. But it would be interesting to see what happens there. But, I think in terms of the party itself, by the 1950s, they're faced with, of course, legal action from the American state. There's tons of deportations of communists who are, quote unquote, foreign, who are immigrants. And of course, anti-communism, the civil rights movement as it's emerging is doing its best, or I shouldn't say doing its best, but trying to distance itself from the communists, because the communists are, equated with a foreign hostile power, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the Cold War changes a lot of the dynamics. And of course, the Communist Party, for all intents and purposes, is destroyed from within and from without in that period.
So we're approaching 2 o'clock, so I might wrap things up at this point. And just thank Sean for an enormously instructive and reflective talk. That if this is your first time hearing or listening to Sean, this is what you get every week if you listen to Sean's Russia, to the SRB podcast, because Sean is enormously skilled, not just at understanding the details of particular historical moments and their stakes and their significance at the time, but being able to step out of those and to understand these questions of the longer sweep of history and the larger sets of questions that doing history can pose to us. So thank you, Sean, for treating us to that skill and this topic today. And we will see you all on the podcast and in future events, both at the Yale Program in Russian East European Studies and at the Jordan Center at NYU. And we will hope to return with some sort of co-sponsored event before too long for you. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance and for your questions, and especially, Sean, to you for the talk.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure seeing all of you, and thank you all of you who tuned in. I really appreciate it. And I should say that a lot of this I'm still working out, so we'll see what the end result is. But thank you all. Have a good day.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Sean.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Josh. Take care. Bye, Rossen.
Goodbye, Sean.
Bye-bye.